The mahogany conference table felt less like furniture and more like an execution block. Air conditioning hummed nervously, cutting through the scent of expensive, stale espresso. Everyone in the room knew a sacrificial lamb was required before market open. They just hadn't expected her to bring receipts. The fluorescent lighting of the executive boardroom had a way of stripping away human dignity, turning even the most expensive Italian wool suits into shades of corporate gray. It was precisely 7:45 a.m. Outside the panoramic windows, Warsaw was waking up under a blanket of heavy slate-colored clouds. But inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly stagnant. The air tasted of ozone, panicked sweat, and the bitter burnt residue of a Jura espresso machine that had been working overtime since dawn. At the head of the table sat Arthur Vance, the chief executive officer, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in the last 50 minutes. To his right was Victoria Sterling, the HR director, a woman whose posture was so flawlessly rigid it suggested a spine forged from disciplinary write-ups and non-disclosure agreements. "Let's not make this more painful than it needs to be, Elena," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a synthesized empathy that wouldn't fool a toddler. She slid a sleek silver pen across the polished mahogany table. It rolled with a hollow, rhythmic clicking sound before coming to a halt against Elena's notebook. "The compliance breach happened on your watch. The payroll anomalies bear your digital signature. For the sake of the company's transition period, and frankly, to avoid a public mess that would ruin your career prospects permanently, you need to take the blame." Elena looked at the pen. Then she looked at Victoria, whose perfectly manicured nails were lightly tapping the edge of her tablet. Elena didn't reach for the pen. Instead, she leaned back into her mesh ergonomic chair, which gave a slight protest of the weary squeak. For the past 3 years, as the senior lead data analyst, Elena had been the ghost in the machine. She was the one who translated chaotic human greed into clean, unassailable spreadsheets. She knew the rhythm of this company better than anyone. She knew when the financial director was nervous by the sudden spike in late-night database queries. And she knew when HR was preparing a restructuring wave by the sudden influx of restricted access logs. She had always been quiet. They had mistaken her silence for compliance. "My signature," Elena repeated softly, her voice a calm contrast to the tense, erratic breathing of the executives around her. "That's an interesting choice of words, Victoria." Arthur shifted his weight, his heavy gold watch clinking against the glass tabletop. "Elena, please. We have an audit committee arriving at 9. The discrepancies in the Q3 labor allocation report total nearly 400,000 euros. It's a systemic error, and as head of data integrity, the buck stops with you. We sign the separation agreement, we issue a press release citing procedural oversight, and we move on. If we dig deeper, the board panics, the stock dips, and nobody wins." What Arthur wasn't mentioning, what everyone in the room was desperately trying to pretend didn't exist, was the ghost not present in the room. Julian, the 26-year-old regional operations manager, who also happened to be Arthur's favorite nephew. Julian, who drove a Porsche he couldn't afford on his official salary, and whose department's administrative expenses looked like a Jackson Pollock painting of fraudulent invoices. Elena looked around the room. 5 pairs of eyes stared back at her, all carrying variations of the same plea. "Die for us so we can keep our bonuses." It was a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. They had spent the last 48 hours altering the server logs, convinced that a data analyst only looked at what was presented on the surface. They truly believed they had buried the digital bodies deep enough. "I understand the urgency," Elena said, her expression entirely unreadable. She reached into her leather bag, pulled out a matte black external hard drive, and plugged it into her laptop. The machine chimed, a cheerful domestic sound that felt entirely inappropriate for a corporate execution. Victoria frowned, her perfectly drawn eyebrows knitting together. "Elena, we aren't here to review your calculations again. The official internal audit report from HR is already finalized. The timestamps are locked." "The official report is locked," Elena corrected gently, a faint ironic smile touching the corners of her lips. But the beauty of automated enterprise architecture is that it doesn't care about hierarchy. It just records. With a few precise keystrokes, Elena opened a secure, encrypted local partition. On the projector screen behind her, a stark white window bloomed into existence. At the top of the directory tree, written in unpretentious block capital letters, was a folder name that caused Victoria's tapping finger to instantly freeze. Backups _ 2025. The room seemed to drop 5 degrees. Arthur took a sudden, sharp breath, his hand instinctively covering his tie clip as if shielding himself from a blow. Elena's fingers hovered over the trackpad, her eyes locked on Victoria, whose face was rapidly losing its expensive, salon-tanned glow. "You see?" Elena whispered into the sudden, heavy silence. "While someone spent Sunday night deleting the original server logs from the primary cloud instance, they forgot one very old-school rule of data architecture." She double-clicked the folder. A cascade of raw, unedited CSV files filled the screen, each one stamped with a digital fingerprint that no HR administrator could ever touch. And the truth was about to be laid bare in a language they couldn't rewrite. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical, pressing down on the executives like the humidity before a summer thunderstorm. On the wall, the minimalist corporate clock clicked over to 8:02 a.m. The digital numbers seemed brutally bright against the dimming confidence of the people in the room. Victoria didn't move. Her gaze was locked onto the screen, where rows of raw data were organizing themselves with algorithmic ruthlessness. "Elena," she said, her voice dropping an octave, abandoning the sweet corporate facade for something much sharper, sweeter, and more dangerous. "This is unauthorized data extraction. Possessing proprietary company archives on a personal device is a violation of your compliance agreement. I could have security escort you out of this building in 3 minutes." "You could," Elena agreed, not looking up from her screen. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with a steady, relaxed rhythm, a stark contrast to Victoria's rigid panic. "But then you'd have to explain to the compliance committee why security was escorting the only person who holds the decryption keys to the original master logs. And looking at the clock, we have exactly 9 minutes before Marcus Vance, the chief financial officer, joins us from London via secure link." Arthur's face went from pale to an unhealthy mottled crimson. Marcus wasn't just the CFO. He was Arthur's older brother, a man famously obsessed with fiscal precision and entirely devoid of family sentimentality when it came to the company's balance sheets. If Marcus found out the numbers had been cooked, brotherly love wouldn't save Arthur from a shareholder revolt. "Let's not lose our tempers," Arthur stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture that looked pathetic for a man holding the title of CEO. "Elena, what exactly do you think you have in that folder?" "I don't think, Arthur. I know," Elena said, her voice cutting through his stuttering like a scalpel. She executed a command script. "This is the raw, unthrottled API log from the HR payroll portal, pulled automatically every night at 11:59 p.m. to an off-site cold storage server. It's part of our standard disaster recovery protocol, a protocol your department skipped when you tried to clean up the system last weekend." She brought up 2 files side by side on the massive projector screen. On the left was the official HR report that Victoria had presented to the board, the one showing Elena's digital signature, approving the €400,000 reallocation of labor costs into a ghost consulting firm. The timestamp read, October 14th, 2:15 p.m. On the right was the raw file from backups _ 2025. The data structure was identical, except for 2 glaring details. First, the approval signature didn't belong to Elena. It belonged to a system administrator account registered directly to Julian's department. Second, the true timestamp of the modification was Sunday, October 19th at 11:14 p.m., a time when Elena was officially clocked out and asleep at home. But when the corporate VPN logged an active session originating from an IP address mapped to a luxury apartment building in downtown Warsaw, Julian's building. "As you can see," Elena explained with cold, clinical irony. Someone went into the production database on Sunday night, manually overrode the user field, pasted my cryptographic signature into the historical entry, and resaved the document. They thought altering the visible metadata on the PDF would be enough. But they forgot that the database keeps a permanent transactional history. You can't just paint over a digital wall and expect the old layers to vanish. Victoria's hands were under the table now, likely twisting her expensive rings into her skin. Her executive composure was entirely gone, replaced by the raw animal panic of someone who realized they had walked into their own trap. This is an unverified backup, Victoria lied, though her voice lacked any real conviction. She looked toward Arthur, silently begging him to pull executive rank and shut the meeting down. It wouldn't hold up in a formal inquiry. Anyone could have faked these CSV logs. Except they are digitally signed by the server's root SSL certificate, Elena replied, leaning forward, her eyes catching the reflection of the glowing data. If the audit committee runs a standard hash verification, these files will match the core server history perfectly. Your modified report, however, will show a corrupted validation sequence. It's a digital forgery, Victoria, and a sloppy one at that. The door to the boardroom clicked. The heavy glass door swung open, and the company's CFO, Marcus Vance, walked in earlier than expected, holding a tablet and looking like a storm cloud incarnate. The atmosphere in the room shattered. Elena didn't close the laptop. She simply moved her cursor to the highlight tool, illuminating the contradictory timestamps in bright, unmissable neon yellow. The real trap had just sprung, and the next few minutes would determine who survived the corporate fallout. If you want to find out how Elena completely dismantles the executive cover-up and see who survives the 8:11 a.m., Marcus Vance did not sit down. He stood at the threshold of the boardroom, his tailored charcoal suit radiating the cold authority of a man who looked at human beings as mere line items on a balance sheet. He glanced at his heavy watch, then at the projector screen, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto the neon yellow highlighted rows. It was precisely 8:07 a.m. "What is this?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet, a low rumble that instantly silenced the erratic breathing of his younger brother. Arthur attempted a smile, but it looked more like a grimace of physical pain. "Marcus, you're early. We were just finalizing the pre-audit review with Elena. A few minor technical discrepancies in the payroll reporting. Nothing to worry about. We've already reached an internal agreement." "An agreement?" Elena murmured, her voice laced with thin, razor-sharp irony. "That's an elegant term for a forced resignation, Arthur." Victoria tried to intervene, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "Marcus, Elena is currently compromised. She has bypassed corporate security protocols, extracted sensitive internal databases to an external device, and is attempting to blackmail the executive committee with unverified, corrupted local copies to hide her own negligence." Marcus didn't even look at Victoria. He walked slowly to the table, pulled out a chair directly opposite Elena, and sat down. He placed his tablet onto the mahogany surface with a sharp, definitive click. "I don't care about your interpersonal drama, Victoria," Marcus said smoothly. "I care about liquidity. And I care about the fact that 45 minutes ago, London compliance flagged an anomalous 400,000 euros variance in our Warsaw operations. I came here to see a head on a spike." He looked directly at Elena, his gray eyes devoid of warmth. "You have exactly 3 minutes to convince me it shouldn't be yours." Elena didn't blink. She reached out and turned the laptop screen slightly toward him. "I don't need 3 minutes, Marcus. I only need 40 seconds. Look at the database transaction IDs." She hit the enter key, executing a precompiled Python script that correlated the server access history with the corporate payroll system. On Sunday night at 11:14 p.m., the primary database was accessed via an administrative override, Elena explained, her voice steady and clinical. The user changed the destination IBAN for the Q3 external contractor funds. They redirected the money from our verified logistics provider to an offshore entity registered in Cyprus under the name JV-Operations Holding. Marcus's eyes flicked down to his own tablet. He began typing, his fingers moving with terrifying speed as he accessed the banking portal. The ambient noise of the room vanished, replaced entirely by the frantic, silent internal calculations of two powerful men, realizing their kingdom was built on sand. The modification was saved using my forged signature, Elena continued, leaning forward. But whoever did it forgot that our network architecture logs the physical MAC address of the device used during the VPN session. The device used to commit this forgery wasn't my corporate laptop. It was an unauthorized iPad, serial number corporate-asset 9942. Arthur's hand flew to his mouth. Victoria looked as if she might faint right onto the expensive carpet. "And who?" Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that made the hairs on the back of Elena's neck stand up. "Is assigned to asset 9942? Elena brought up the Global Asset Registry. The name next to the serial number was written in clean, indisputable text. Julian Vance, Regional Operations Manager. The clock on the wall shifted. 8:11 a.m. Marcus looked up from his tablet, his face completely pale, his expression frozen into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had the final banking confirmation on his screen. The timestamps from the real bank transfer perfectly matched the Sunday night entry in Elena's backups_2025 folder. They didn't match Victoria's fabricated HR report by a margin of 5 days. Marcus slowly turned his gaze toward his brother, then toward Victoria. The corporate gaslighting was over. The predator had become the prey, and the smell of executive panic in the room was now thick enough to choke on. "Who?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with a quiet, terrifying rage that vibrated through the entire boardroom. "Tried to protect the nephew?" Silence. Complete, absolute, suffocating silence. The silence stretched, long and agonizing, punctuated only by the distant muffled sound of a tram passing on the street down below. Arthur looked everywhere but at his brother. He stared at his coffee cup, at the silver pen, at the geometric patterns on the carpet, anywhere to avoid the icy glare of the man who held his entire professional life in his hands. Victoria looked even worse. The rigid composure she had worn like armor for years had completely collapsed. Her jaw was slightly open, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths. She knew exactly what protecting the nephew meant in this context. It meant complicity. It meant she was no longer just an HR director managing a messy internal situation. She was an accessory to a major financial crime. "I am waiting," Marcus said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange resonant quality that seemed to echo off the glass walls of the boardroom. He didn't look like a brother right now. He looked like a judge executing a sentence. "Marcus, please," Arthur finally choked out, his voice thin and cracked. He reached up and loosened his tie, his fingers trembling. Julian is family. He made a terrible mistake. He got over his head with some bad investments in crypto. He was desperate. He came to Victoria on Friday terrified. We thought if we could just cover the variance temporarily, reclassify it as a data entry error, we could fix the books after the Q3 audit passed. We were going to have him pay it back quietly over the next fiscal year." "With what money, Arthur?" Marcus asked, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "The money he steals from our logistics partners? Or the money you plan to take out of Elena's severance package after you destroyed her reputation?" Elena sat perfectly still, watching the spectacle with a detached, almost academic interest. It was fascinating to see how quickly the corporate pyramid inverted when the foundation of lies collapsed. Just 15 minutes ago, these same people were casually discussing how to ruin her life to save their own skin. Now, they were bargaining for a shred of mercy. "It was Victoria's idea," Arthur blurted out, his survival instinct completely overriding any sense of executive loyalty. He pointed a shaking finger at the HR director. She said the easiest way to satisfy compliance was to find a single point of failure in the data department. She said Elena was quiet, that she didn't have political allies in the upper management, that she would just take the settlement and leave without making a scene. Victoria's head snapped toward Arthur, her eyes wide with betrayal. Arthur, you signed off on every single document. You were the one who gave me the cryptographic signature file from the archives. Because you told me it was clean, Arthur shouted back, his face turning an alarmed shade of purple. You told me the backup systems wouldn't catch it. Enough, Marcus snapped. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer force of the word cut through their desperate bickering like a guillotine. He stood up, picked up his tablet, and turned to look out the window at the gray Warsaw sky. The corporate clock on the wall now read 8:16 a.m. The audit committee would be arriving in exactly 44 minutes. Victoria, Marcus said, not turning around. You will walk back to your office right now. You will write a letter of immediate resignation, citing personal reasons. You will leave your corporate phone, your laptop, and your building pass on your desk. If you are still in this building by 8:30 a.m., I will personally call the Central Anti-Corruption Bureau and hand over this entire drive. Victoria didn't say a word. She gathered her tablet with numb, clumsy movements, stood up, and walked out of the room. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind her, sounding remarkably like a cell door locking. Arthur swallowed hard, looking up at his brother with a desperate, pathetic hope. Marcus, and what about me? What do we tell the board about Julian? Marcus finally turned around, but his eyes weren't on Arthur. He was looking directly at Elena. That depends entirely, Marcus said smoothly, on what our new global director of data integrity decides to do with the contents of that folder. The title felt heavy in the quiet room. Global Director of Data Integrity. It was the corporate equivalent of a battlefield promotion, offered not out of merit, but out of a desperate need to buy her silence. Elena let out a short, quiet laugh, a sharp sound that made Arthur flinch. She leaned back, looking at the two Vance brothers. One was a broken man, looking at the ruin of his family dynasty. The other was a cold calculator trying to patch a leaking ship before the storm hit. Global Director, Elena repeated, testing the words on her tongue. It's an expensive title, Marcus, but it comes with a very messy inheritance. It comes with a direct reporting line to me, Marcus said, his eyes drilling into her, and a compensation package that reflects the absolute necessity of your discretion. We reclassify Julian's variance as an unauthorized operational cost, freeze his assets internally, and let legal handle him quietly. The audit committee gets a clean report. The company survives. You get the recognition you've actually earned. Arthur looked at Elena, his eyes wide and begging. He was completely at her mercy, waiting to see if she would pull the trigger or accept the bribe. Elena looked down at her laptop. On the screen, the lines of code in backups _2025 were still pulsing softly. For years, she had watched people like Victoria and Arthur rewrite reality to suit their needs, sacrificing anyone who didn't have a title or a family name. They thought everything could be bought, managed, or deleted. I have a counter-proposal, Marcus, Elena said, her voice dropping into a calm, resolute register that brooked no argument. Marcus tilted his head, his expression tightening. I'm listening. I will take the position, Elena said, closing the laptop lid with a definitive soft click. But we are not hiding Julian's mess. The 400,000 euros will be reported to the audit committee at 9 a.m. as a discovered internal fraud, flagged and caught by the data integrity department. Julian will be terminated immediately, and the police will be notified. Arthur will announce his early retirement by the end of the week, citing health reasons. Arthur let out a weak moan, sinking deeper into his chair. And if I refuse? Marcus asked, his voice turning dangerously cold. If I decide to take my chances with the auditors? Elena picked up the matte black external hard drive and slipped it into her bag. Then this drive doesn't just go to London compliance. It goes to the financial press, the Polish Financial Supervision Authority, and every major shareholder on our board. By 9:15 a.m., the stock will be in a free fall that no amount of brotherly love can fix. Silence returned to the boardroom, but this time it belonged entirely to Elena. Marcus stared at her for 5 long seconds. He looked at the closed laptop, then at his trembling brother, and finally at the clock. It was 8:22 a.m. The corporate machinery was moving, and he had to make a choice. A slow, grim smile appeared on Marcus's face, the look of a cynic recognizing a superior player. You have a remarkably ruthless grasp of data management, Elena. I just know how to read the logs, Marcus, Elena replied, standing up and slinging her bag over her shoulder. They never lie. She walked toward the glass doors, leaving the two executives alone in the heavy ozone-scented air of the boardroom. As the doors clicked shut behind her, the bright natural light of the Warsaw morning finally broke through the clouds, flooding the hallway. For the first time in 3 years, Elena breathed in deeply. The ghosts in the machine were gone, and she was finally the one holding the keys.